So we're here today at Cleveland, which is part of the Ramsar Protected Wetlands of Moreton Bay. With me is Robert Bush from the Queensland Waders Study Group, who is going to help us to understand the importance of this protected area and the threats faced by this part of our coastline and the birds who visit it. So we appreciate you, Robert, for joining us today.
Yeah, very good to be here and to be down by this wonderful part of the world.
Robert, I believe this area on the Cleveland shoreline is part of a Ramsar protected area in Moreton Bay. So could you firstly tell us what the Ramsar Convention is?
I can, and let me give you just a little history lesson. If you go back 51 years, Ramsar is actually a small town in the northern part of Iran. And the United Nations agencies brought together the countries of the world, this town, to write a convention, a statement put together by all the countries of the world to protect the world's best sites, wetland sites. Wetlands are remarkable places, full of biodiversity. They're so important to the survival of the planet and to ourselves as well. And this is one of them. And Australia was a very enthusiastic member of the Ramsar Convention. It was one of the first countries to sign up. And to date, more than 70 areas of Australia are now Ramsar sites. National governments put up to the Ramsar Convention Secretariat that they'd like certain areas of their countries to become Ramsar sites. They have to meet certain criteria. The area has to be internationally significant, and then it's agreed to, and that country then agrees to look after those sites and to protect them for the future. And that's what Australia does. It does it through the EPBC Act, which is the main Environment Act in Australia, that says that if you want to do or make any change to this area, you have to ask the Minister, the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment, whether you can do that. And these sites are protected, so so far, not a single site in Australia has ever been changed.
So this area is visited by a number of migratory shorebirds which are critically endangered. So can you tell us a bit about these birds?
Yes, so migratory shorebirds are some of the great long-distance flyers in the world. They nest up in the Arctic, in the Arctic and subarctic, and they live here, down in Moreton Bay and along the coast of east and west coast of Australia. Moreton Bay is probably one of the most important areas for them. About 35,000 of them spend their summers here. They live here, and then they fly all the way north to breed, and then they come back. They're just coming back now. 35,000, a bit more than that, because the ones that go to New Zealand have a bit of a stopover here, and they're here at the moment. Birds called the red knot. There are about 25, 26, 27 different species, and this is their home. Unfortunately, they're declining a great deal, but they're one of the great long-distance flyers. The important thing about the flying is that they don't just hop up the coast, they go flat out for 9, 10, 11 days, non-stop, all the way up to China, then feed up for a couple of weeks, maybe more, and then they fly the last 2,000 or 3,000 kilometres up into the Arctic where they breed. They go there because when the ice melts, there's an awful lot of insects. Yes. And we might not find it very pleasant. I've been up there, not a very pleasant place for us to be, but absolutely perfect for them. Lots of food, lots of insects, and then they come back here and spend the rest of the year here.
And so what are the threats to these birds, and how are they important to the health of the local ecosystem now and into the future?
Well, the threats are three. The first is climate change, and the sea level rise is going to rise. If you look here, it's very flat. This is going to rise in the next 50 years by a metre or so. It's going to come right over the top. These mud flats are areas where they feed, so that poses a danger. And also, when the tide's in, as it is mostly now, they need to go to slightly higher ground, open ground areas where they can rest. And those areas are likely to get flooded as well. So the first thing is sea level rise because of climate change. The second is development. A lot of us like to live along the coast, and we have to learn how to share the shorelines. Sharing the shorelines in southeast Queensland, the population is going to grow by a couple of million over the next 20 to 25 years. They've all got to fit in here, and so have the birds. So we have to learn how to share the shorelines so the birds get a space and we get a space. And the third area is disturbance. These birds need to rest, and we like to take our dogs for a walk or go for a walk, and we need to learn that when we see these birds, we just, walk around them, get around them, leave them at peace. Because when they do their long journeys north, for about 3 or 4 months before, they feed up. They put on, in one massive amount, they double their weight.
Yep.
And they need their time. If you scare them and they lift up, they can't put on that weight, and it puts them at risk.
And what are the important things that need to be done to protect the biodiversity of this special place and to make it more resilient in the face of climate change impacts?
Well, I think the first thing is that we are members of international agreements. The Ramsar site is Ramsar is the most important, but there are actually others. And we need to respect that and recognise at a government level, but also amongst ourselves as people, that biodiversity is really part of our lives. And that to do that means that we're living with nature rather than dominating nature, and allow nature and ourselves to live in harmony a lot more. And that means making some adaptations. It means recognising that we need to change our lifestyle, and we need to ensure that we maintain this biodiversity in Moreton Bay, which is part of what is going to be one of the great cities of the world. And what could be more fantastic to have a great city of the world in which half of it is one of the world's great biodiverse areas. Yes. And I'll give you a real example of what I mean by that biodiversity. We're here on the Walter Park, which is basically a large grassy area. Fantastic for us. 2 weeks ago I was here. 400 people met here to welcome back the shorebirds. There was a cricket game going on for the under-14s. There was a futsal for the under-7s. There were about 30 people walking the dogs in the dog park. There was a sausage sizzle going on. Fantastic for us. But step 10 metres over there, and that's when you begin to see the real diversity. First of all, you meet some of the seagrass, and you see, as we've just seen, oyster catchers and some of the surface peckers pecking the birds, pecking the food. A bit further out, where it's a bit softer, you see the wonderful Bartel godwit, a migratory shorebird that flies for 8, 9, 10, 11 days non-stop. It's got a bill about this length. It goes down into the mud to find polychaetes. They're longworms. It's a specialist at longworm. It can find longworms. Go a bit further out and you'll find the eastern curlew. It's like about the size of a football. It weighs 1 kilo. It's the biggest migratory shorebird in the world, and it's got this bill that's bigger than its whole body. It's a bit like having a nose that goes down to your ankles. Imagine that. And it's out there just next to Cassam Island, and it's going even further down, and it looks for crabs. It's a crab specialist, and it finds them really deep down. So you've got the surface peckers with all the surface, then you've got the worms, then you've got that. And further out on Cassam Island at the moment, because the tide's in, I can tell you there are 700 to 800 shorebirds, migratory shorebirds, of 3 species, the only 3 that actually live in trees. And they're there on there, and they come off the mudflats and they live there. And when the tide goes out, they leave there and they go round here. It's amazing. Yeah. And that's because of this amazing diversity in the mud, on the surface of the mud, in the mangroves, in this whole area. Amazing. And that's just the biodiversity for the birds. There's a lot more biodiversity for fish, where the fish spawn, and for dugongs, and for turtles, and so forth. We've got the lawn here. We like our barbecues. They like that. Yes. Learning to live together is the secret for the future. Sure.
And how important is it for the critically endangered migratory shorebirds and this precious ecosystem you've talked about to get good outcomes at both the COP27 on climate and the COP15 on biodiversity?
So, in the next few months, there are 2 big international meetings. Yes. Where countries, the specialists and politicians as well from these countries come together to discuss climate change, and the fact that climate is changing and we need to change our ways to reduce CO2 in the air, and biodiversity. Biodiversity is what gives us things like medicines and so on. Without biodiversity, we don't have many of the medicines that we have in the world, and so on. And it provides us with the kind of mixture of things in the world that allows us to live well. And And so those international meetings are really important because they encourage countries to get together and to make changes in laws and regulation, and to encourage the people of different countries to start bringing nature back into our world. It's for about three generations, we've extinguished nature for most of us in our lives. Children get out, they go on a school trip to see something. But how many people know that this is the month when 35 to 40,000 birds from the Arctic actually are here? They've just arrived. It's amazing. We've just been watching some local birds, which is just the beginning of mating. We forget about these things, but how fantastic it is if it becomes simply part of our lives. Oh, it's December. This is the month that this happens. Oh, it's March. This is the time when the eastern curlew fly north, and you can hear them at night, because they always leave at night, about 10 or 11 at night, lifting high in the air and flying non-stop for 8 or 9, 10 days till they reach the Yellow Sea, which is their first stopping point.
Thanks, Robert. You've really helped us to understand a lot about the importance of protecting these wetlands.
You're welcome.
World leaders will come together for two critical meetings later this year. The COP, or COP27 conference on climate in Egypt in November, and the COP15 conference on biodiversity in Canada in December. We are at a critical moment in the life of this planet. The decisions made at these meetings will shape the future of the endangered birds we've talked about today and of this precious habitat in Cleveland. And clearly they will also shape the future for all who live on Earth in so many ways. The theme of the season of creation for 2022 is Listen to the Voice of Creation. We are facing so many major ecological threats because we haven't paid attention to what's happening to the environment of which all of us are a part. We can't continue to ignore the voices of the critically endangered birds all around here and other species here in Cleveland and in other parts of the world. Climate change is already having a serious impact, and the loss of so many animal and plant species is alarming. The recently released State of the Environment report for Australia tells us that things are getting bad, and it seems they'll only get worse unless we unite to take decisive action on both climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So I urge you to learn more about these important concerns, which Pope Francis spoke about in his message for the World Day of Prayer for Care of Creation. People of faith are joining with people of goodwill here and around the world to make sure that the commitments made at the COP27 on climate and on the COP15 on biodiversity will be sufficient to halt the rapid loss of biodiversity and to prevent climate change from spiralling out of control. I encourage you all to look for opportunities to get involved in efforts to make these two important meetings count. Places like this are precious. They support and sustain a rich and wonderful web of life which we cannot afford to lose. We are not separate from the rest of creation. We are a part of it, and we have a sacred responsibility to care for this place, our common home. Let's accept this God-given responsibility and act together to meet the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss.